welcome everybody. Great to have you all with us today. And joining us is special guest Senator Anne Ruston, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Senate and the Coalition's Shadow Minister for Health and Aged Care. No doubt for many of you, Anne is well known. She's obviously been a senior spokesperson for the Coalition, both in government and obviously now in opposition. But for those of you who may not be as know Anne as well as others, as I said, she's the Shadow Minister for Health and Aged Care, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Senate, Liberal Senator for South Australia since 2012, and is obviously one of the Coalition's, if not the most senior health spokes policy people, with responsibility for scrutinising the government across health and aged care, including issues such as primary care, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, aged care, preventative health, medtech, and health force policy. And obviously she has been in and around the area of health, aged care and that broader social policy portfolio for a long time. And great to have you, Anne. And obviously Anne, as I said, is a South Australian senator. Anne, a lot of big issues in the portfolio, health and aged care alone, $180 billion spend. But let's get, I think, on one of the biggest topical issues at the moment and certainly driving a lot of community discussion, access to affordable medications. The industry has been saying for some time now that patients are waiting too long to access new and innovative medication. The debate over patient access to these medications has certainly heated up in recent times, but there certainly has been an issue that the patient groups and the industry have been talking about for a lot longer. In your view, has the balance between affordability and access shifted too far, and what do you think needs to change?
Well, I think it's been quite clear for a really long time that we needed to do something about the process by which a medicine or medication or treatment is listed in Australia. That's why probably 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was Greg Hunt who first raised the issue of making sure that health technology assessment processes, which is where we assess our medicines, is fit for purpose for modern day, because it's an old process. It's obviously a clunky process. It's it takes a long time because everything has to happen sequentially instead of concurrently, et cetera, et cetera. So we had the HTA review. It came up with some pretty good recommendations that needed to be considered, and the government's basically sat on their hands for the last 2.5 years and hasn't done anything about it. So I think Australians rightly should be concerned about the fact that they are missing out on anywhere up to 70-75% of the medications that other countries around the world are providing access to their citizens, and yet the government seems to still be out there spruiking the idea that they're getting cheaper medicines and they're getting there's some access access is fine. But the reality is that, sure, the medications that are on the PBS might be cheaper and they might be locked in at 25% for a general prescription. But the reality is that Australians are missing out on so many medications. And I think Australians would be very surprised to learn that we are actually at the bottom of the pile in many instances and getting further towards the bottom of the pile as days go by when it comes to access to medicines in this country.
Look, it's a really good point, and I'll come to that. Certainly also, I should have said at the beginning, people, please put any questions you have for Anne in the public chat box and we'll get to as many of them as you can. And you specifically mentioned the HTA review, and you're right, it obviously started now 6 years ago under your former cabinet colleague, Greg Hunt. And the industry have invested, the last 4 years, a lot of good people, a lot of time and effort into getting some outcomes. And on budget night, I think it's fair to say, not only were the industry disappointed, but I think it's fair to say that probably a lot of down the line patient groups would have been disappointed as well. So further to what you've said, what needs to happen in terms of getting real and lasting HTA reform? And one of our contributors, Kieran, has asked, what are you going to do to hold Mark Butler to account on this, which you've said, I think, on many occasions, that that's certainly one of your key objectives?
Well, I will continue to be calling out this government. I mean, honestly, every time I get up and speak at a health forum, whether it be a patient forum, an industry forum, I feel like it's Groundhog Day. You stand up there and you say the same thing. Where is the outcome and the response to the HTA review? Where is our reform so Australians can get quicker access to life-saving or life-changing medicines? But the most important place, I think, that will put pressure on the government to actually act is when people who are impacted start telling their stories. And when you hear stories of kids having to go overseas to get treatment and, their families having to crowdfund hundreds of thousands of dollars just so they can save their child's life when, the government's sitting on its hands. And I mean, a classic example of that is the proton therapy facility that is, it's 7 or 8 years in the pipeline at the moment, and all we've got is a bunker in Adelaide. We don't have any technology, and we're seeing, story after story of kids going overseas or, quite frankly, being harmed by less effective and less safe treatments because they can't afford to go overseas. I mean, it's just simply not good enough. And so I'd encourage, and I will continue to talk to the patient groups particularly, they really do need to make sure that they are calling out the government for their specific examples, because it's those real life stories that I think really hits home at what Australians are missing out on at the moment.
Look, it's a really good point, and certainly that, as I said, has come to the fore in the last little while. It sort of brings me to a question which you'll certainly touch on. How important, from your experience, is the role of patient groups in basically bringing that reality and bringing these stories to life?
Nothing could be more important, Jody. Nothing could be more important. I mean, I stand in Canberra with my colleagues when brave survivors come and tell.
So to those that are tuning in, Anne's unfortunately dropped out and she was having some initial technical issues. So we're just going to try and seek to get her to obviously rejoin. So please be a little bit patient and we'll try and get Anne back online. So Anne will be reconnecting as soon as she can, which hopefully won't be too long. So, yeah. And keep the questions coming. There's a lot of questions coming through on the Q&A chat. And as I said, we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And so obviously there's a lot of issues to get through, a lot of questions. So please persevere. Unfortunately, modern technology doesn't always pan out perfectly. So Anne's I've just been advised by her office in the process of reconnecting. So she should be back on very, very soon. So just hold there, please. That would be really great. As I said, keep your questions coming, and we'll seek to address as many. Welcome back, Anne.
My sincere apologies. I told you me and technology didn't work very well together.
Questions, Anne. So Liz asks, if you look at the action of the US administration, do you see any signs that the government is taking the threat of the MFN seriously and will respond to ensure Australians can still benefit from new innovative medications coming to Australia?
Well, I am extremely concerned about the tariff response of the US government, because obviously, as we all know, that many of our medications and treatments come out of the US. It's a big market and it has a very dominant capacity to influence the market outcome there. So yes, I am very worried about it. But I mean, I've been raising this issue now for 12 months since Donald Trump first put it on the agenda back in early 2025. And so far, I have not seen any sense of urgency, either from the minister, the government, or through questioning through estimates, but I think we're already starting to see a little bit of this play out, whether it's directly as a result of MFN or whether it is a more generalisation in terms of the world market for drugs. The decision by Eli Lilly a few months ago not to list their weight loss drug in Australia, I think is a sign of what's about to come. The fact that we are missing out on a lot of medications. I was talking to a big pharmaceutical company last week, and they're saying of the new treatments that are in the pipeline, they'll be lucky to probably bring to Australia better than probably 10 or 15% of them. So I think it is a real and present danger. I think it's already starting to show signs of having an impact in Australia. And quite frankly, if I was the Minister for Health, I would be very, very worried about the impact this is going to have on Australians' access to life-changing and life-saving medications. And there is a significant cost implication here too. So, yeah, I think admiring the problem from afar is failing Australians, and that's what the government appears to be doing.
Look, the Eli Lilly example around the weight loss drugs, the GLP-1s, is a really interesting one, and you may not have seen it last night, but it featured heavily the GLP-1s on 60 Minutes, actually. So this is now, getting to be one of those, I think, barbecue stopper type issues. Do you think in terms of what we're seeing then around that is a bit like the canary in the coal mine, Anne, given that at the end of the day, Australia is a small market, say, versus the US? But as I think you've alluded to, it's a sign potentially and could be sadly to the detriment of the Australian community and patient access.
Well, I mean, Australia is very unique, but actually in this instance, we're unique and potentially that will be to our detriment. We are a very small market relative to most of the particularly first world markets that are big pharmaceutical companies supply. We're a long way away from where manufacture generally takes place because a lot of it's either in Europe or in the US. And so we're sort of right at the end of that supply chain when you talk about supply chain logistics. And for the last, decades, we have sought a very aggressive price reduction strategies in terms of the price that Australia pays for medication. So it's sort of really a bit of a triple whammy here in terms of the risk that we are at in terms of access to medications. And it is very, very real. But we have to accept the fact that we don't have the kind of bargaining power that the big markets have, particularly the US, and we need to be very mindful of that.
No, it's a very, very good point, and certainly a long way to go. Just moving on to some other issues, Anne, because you've got such a big portfolio. As I said, health and aged care alone is $180 billion spend. You add in the NDIS, I think it takes it up to around $230 billion, $240 billion. So, 1/3 of the Commonwealth budget is health, aged care, NDIS, and obviously related programs. So against that background, there's obviously demand for services and medications and medical technology continues to grow. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing Australia's healthcare system over the next decade, and where should governments be focusing their efforts?
Well, I don't think I have said it less than 2,000 times. We must focus on prevention. We have to make sure, prevention, early intervention, primary care, because, quite frankly, it's better for the patient because the sooner you can get on top of an issue, or if you can prevent the health issue happening in the first place, the better it is for the person. But it's better for the budget as well, because, of course, we know that tertiary care is much, much more expensive than primary care. So, first and foremost, we have to move our focus back to the front end of keeping Australians healthy. Quite frankly, we run a sick care system in this country. We don't run a healthcare system. And the federal government seems to be, more focused on delaying care than they are in actually providing the necessary supports for primary care, and which is why I've always been a great supporter of making sure that the GP, allied health are all at the focus at the front end, but also prevention, because a dollar saved, a dollar not spent is a dollar saved, and we need to start looking at our health and aged care and even our disability budgets as investments in productivity and better outcomes, not as a cost sunk on somebody's bad health. And I think there really does need to be a mindset change around the opportunities that I think technology and innovation have in health and aged care and disability care that actually can drive productivity. It seems to be completely ignored. The Treasurer's Roundtable, Productivity Roundtable last year, didn't even bring health into it. It's just crazy. It is the place that we could get the best benefit for the budget, but also the best benefit for Australians.
Yeah, it's a really good point, the discussion around prevention, and because it's certainly not a new one, but it's just like the system, regardless of who is in government, struggles to get their head around the changes that are needed. And to your point, a dollar spent today is $2 saved tomorrow. And particularly in the age, as you say, of increasing, innovation in medical technology and pharmaceuticals and what that can mean. And also ultimately, as you mentioned too, I think the benefits to productivity, workforce and the like. I'll just go to a couple of questions, Anne. Danielle from the Leukemia Foundation said, really appreciated your insights on the HTA review. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the rollout of the Australian Comprehensive Cancer Network and the role the Commonwealth has to play in the state delivery of these models. From their perspective, they'd like to see more uniform delivery of this across states and territories with a focus on ensuring that patients are not disadvantaged simply because of their postcode. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Look, it is a huge problem in Australia. We're a tiny country when you consider population, although we're big when we come to geography, but we have a small population, and it seems quite crazy that the healthcare of somebody who lives in Albury could potentially be different to the healthcare availability and access to somebody that lives in Wodonga because they just happen to have a border that runs in between them. And I think a lot of that was really highlighted during COVID when we had border shutdowns. But I think there is a greater role to be played by the federal government of trying to get greater consistency between the states and territories in terms of what is being delivered and what is being rolled out. And that also delivers efficiency, because if you've got one set of rules, then surely you only need one set of regulation, one set of compliance. And in the case of, if you have to register for a particular service delivery, you only have to do it one time. I mean, it seems crazy that in many instances, you might be providing a service, and if you want to provide that service in different states, you've actually got to go and do all of their compliance and regulatory stuff in each state. The other thing too, which is a really salient point around the states and territories versus the Commonwealth, it's this division of who does what. The greatest saving and efficiencies can be gained by the investment in primary care. But the benefit and the savings actually occurs in the states and territories because they will avoid the tertiary care, which ultimately happens in hospitals. I think we have got to do more to join up our healthcare system so that we actually can be focusing on the efficiency of the system as a whole instead of cost shifting. And if you want the greatest example of the most stupid decision that I have seen made in relation to healthcare is the decision of the federal government to remove the additional rebate for older Australians over the age of 65 who have private health insurance.
Oh, yes.
The government can book the saving on the bottom line of their federal budget, but they themselves know, because they've got independent advice, the cost to the states and territories will be more than the saving that goes on to the federal budget. So federal budget gets a $3 billion save. The states and territories, by their own report, will get in excess of a $4 billion cost put on their bottom line. So the net impact is taxpayers pay $1 billion more for something just because this stupid interface between the states and territories and the Commonwealth. So it's a really, really good question, and I think it is the underpins so much of what we see goes wrong in health in this country, because the states and territories and the Commonwealth spend all their time trying to cost shift between each other.
Look, it's a really good point, and I see down the track come the next hospital reform or agreement between the states will be looking to recoup that extra cost, no doubt, through an increased funding agreement on hospitals. But, as you know, unfortunately too, then, in the forward estimates, then the government can go, but we're making this saving. Yes. But anyway, we won't go down the rabbit burrow on that one. And you've mentioned primary health care, and I think it's fair to say this government, since assuming office, has had a big focus on primary health care and Medicare, and have, put a lot of money into it. But I think there's a key question here in regards to primary healthcare and Medicare. As you know, it was introduced in 1984, but is it still fit for purpose, Anne? Does it require fundamental reform to meet the future healthcare needs and to meet major changes in health technology, for example?
Well, I think the concept of universal access to primary care, I think it is take it as a given. It is a really important, and it's the most important element that underpins the great healthcare system that we have in Australia. So I think, Medicare and the delivery of that universal access to primary care, nothing could be more important has been important for 40 years and it will be important for the next 40 years. But, you do make a really good point that technology and innovation in medicines, in technologies, just in the delivery of care has changed so much since Medicare first came in. We see a shift from people spending a long time in hospital after they've had procedures, because innovation and technology means they can get out of hospital and they can get into living, going back home, the delivery of hospital in the home, as an example. Technologies that, are cost effective in their delivery, but they're not necessarily cost effective on a unit by unit basis. I do think that the government needs to make sure that they're doing everything they possibly can to get people access. efficient and effective access to technologies. I wonder whether there's sometimes that the Department of Health doesn't just say, this is the way it's always been done and we'll just keep letting it happen that way again and again. And in the process of doing that, they really are denying Australians a health system that is innovating at the same speed as the sector is innovating. You know, we need to be walking along this journey at the same pace at the same time. But I just think the department just seems to be stuck in a paradigm that, you know, an activity-based clunky old paradigm that was probably fit for purpose 40 years ago, but isn't reflective of the dynamic, ever-changing, innovative healthcare sector that exists in the world at the moment. Yeah. And we're missing out because we are not agile enough to be able to respond to what's happening around the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it is a great system, but yes, it is 40 years old. And increasingly around, as you say, Anne, the innovation, whether it's medtech or pharmaceuticals, and this increasing interaction as well in terms of like with MSAC and PBAC and those new medications in particular that are coming through. And you do question, well, is Medicare, you know, now fit for purpose? But also, unfortunately, change does take a lot of time to push through changes to the system. But no, it's a point well made. And aged care, probably one of the next biggest issues obviously out there in the community. You're at the forefront of it as a shadow minister. So we've seen significant reform since the Aged Care Royal Commission. So as you look at progress to date, what do you think has worked, what hasn't worked, and what need to be the next priorities?
Look, the reality is this idea that you can ration care or withhold care from older Australians who've been assessed as needing that care, the idea that you can use an algorithm that has no human override capacity to determine people's care needs, that continues to spit out what appears to be many, many incorrect determinations. I think that older Australians and their families have got every right to be pretty upset about our aged care, that the aged care reforms and the failure of them to have been efficiently delivered. You know, the customer interface with My Aged Care. I mean, I don't know how many people that are on your podcast today, Jody, have ever tried to navigate the My Aged Care website to try and, you know, do an assessment for themselves or for a loved one. I mean, like, I would guess that there are hundreds, thousands, possibly even tens of thousands of older Australians who just plainly give up. It is just so cumbersome and it's so not customer friendly. So, you know, I think there were a lot of great recommendations that came out of the Royal Commission, but the fact that this government has let the wait lists blow out from, I think it was down to 28,000, had blow out to in excess of 100,000, the fact that we've got over 100,000 people waiting to be assessed, the fact that we've got wait times for anybody who's not a priority, somewhere between 10 and 12 months, and only 0.1% of older Australians are assessed as being high priority. So it basically means every single Australian who has been assessed for an aged care package will wait 10 to 12 months. And then when they do get their aged care package, they're being given it at 60% of the value that they've been assessed as, of the care they've been assessed as needing. There are some really serious questions this government needs to answer. And quite frankly, the most important of those is the government withholding care from older Australians because they're worried about their budget bottom line? You know, it is just incredible. So they're making older Australians sicker, more dependent, and many of them are dying waiting for their aged care. It's a complete false economy. It's a bit like primary care. If you give them people care, the level of care they need when they need it, they're much more likely not to need the sort of like the more acute care that they will if they're left for months and months and months without support. It's very distressing, and I have so many older Australians who contact us and other members of Parliament, and it's just wrong.
Yeah, sometimes the human face of reform is pretty damn hard, as you rightly point out. And I think I noted last week that the government finally backtracked, I think, on that algorithm-driven assessment tool.
No, they didn't really.
Oh, okay, I misread that.
No. So what happened was last Thursday we put forward a bill which we got through the Senate with the support of the crossbench and the Greens, that said that they had to introduce human override. But the minister's still refusing to do that. He's basically saying, we'll let the algorithm, if there appears to be an anomaly, we'll put it back through the algorithm again. But if you don't change the algorithm or the way you're doing it, you just get two wrong answers. So, I hope the minister actually realises that this algorithm is absolutely horrid in terms of many of its outcomes, and he actually does something. But while I will give him credit when I see that he's done the job, so far he's failed to come to the party.
Fair enough. And I think, your point just about, the use of those online tools, which is that, that first portal of interface, Jesus, I struggle with MyGov, and I can't even begin to imagine what it's like for families in aged care. On a question, Anne, I'll just bring this up. So we have a question here from Daniel. Thousands of Australian MS patients are facing the prospect of losing subsidised access to life-changing medicines. They are currently stable after the listing of a new medicine in MS early this year. Australian Health Economic Analysis indicating that these DMTs reduce healthcare utilisation, delay disability, lessen reliance on the NDIS, and help people remain employed and socially engaged. These matters are being, it says the companies are warning that the current pricing framework, PBS, basically is outdated and effectively forcing vital medicines off the market. What is the coalition's view on this, and what would you see yourself doing as Health Minister in response?
Yeah, it's a classic example, Daniel, of what we were talking about at the start of our discussion today. And that is that unless we actually implement the changes that need to be to the health technology assessment process, we will continue to have the cost of the drug being really pretty much the only determinant of whether the drug is going to be available in Australia. We have got to change that and start looking at the value of the drug, because value and cost are very, very different things. And so I think that my absolute focus, should I be lucky enough to one day, hopefully soon, be the health minister, is to actually start talking about the value proposition, because the value proposition, as I said at the start, it's not just good for the budget, it's good for the person. And if you can end up by, making sure that people are getting the medication that allows them to go back to work, be productive members of society, not be a continuing drain on the health system because they aren't able to be able to get access to, what they need to keep them, to help them in their condition. It's a crazy, it's a false economy. So I think, my answer to you is we have to look at the value of these medications and not just be so obsessed with the cost of them.
And I've certainly got some more questions, but I'm conscious of your time as well. How much more time do you think you have?
Oh, I've got a few minutes.
Okay. Look, this is, I think, a fascinating issue, and it's just now, coming into everybody's world, artificial intelligence. So it's rapidly changing healthcare, rapidly changing how we do our everyday jobs. But from a health perspective, from diagnostics to drug discovery and patient care, where do you see the greatest opportunities, and where should governments be drawing the regulatory boundaries? How far do you see AI going in changing healthcare?
Look, it is got to be one of the most topical issues at the moment across the board, and none more so in healthcare, because AI will enable, if it's used appropriately within the right regulatory frameworks, where people's information needs to be protected, because I know there is, and justifiably so, a level of concern about the protection and the privacy of people's data. But I think if we are able to put the framework and put the constraints in place to be able to protect the identity of the data and the privacy of individual data, but at the same time be able to use, de-identified data, we can actually start moving away from this sort of output activity-based approach to healthcare, and actually start driving towards investment in outcome-driven healthcare. So I think AI offers us an amazing opportunity, but we must get that regulatory framework right in the first place, as I said, in terms of protection of the data and protection of privacy, because the first time something goes wrong and there is a data breach, everybody will lose confidence in the system, and it it will break down. So I think the first move must be to come up with a really robust regulatory framework that Australians can all have great confidence and comfort in. And I think once Australians are comfortable with that framework, they'll be fine. I mean, we've been comfortable with the regulatory framework around the banking sector, and we've trusted the banks with all of our money and information for a very long time. We need the same sort of robust framework that Australians will have confidence in. And then I think the opportunities of AI are enormous for the healthcare sector.
Yeah, it's a very good analogy, but as you say, the key word's obviously trust, because if there's not the trust there in something new, you're right. If that first failure, it'll be years trying to recover. In interest of time, I'll just wrap up then with this last question for you, Anne. If you could ask Australia's healthcare industry to partner with political stakeholders on one issue over the next 5 years, what would it be?
Look, I am very concerned about the breakdown of the public-private equilibrium that exists within our healthcare system in Australia at the moment. There seems to be a constant pressure on whether it's the cost of private health insurance, the viability of our private hospital sector, obviously, access to medical technologies in an appropriate way, the cost of specialist fees, etc. The one thing I would say the sector needs to get together is to actually agree on how we re-establish that equilibrium and balance between the private and the public sector, so that Australians can continue to have choice, but they can continue to have the safety net that is the public system. If the private system fails, the public system will go under incredible pressure. We already know that it's stretched at the seams and in some instances it's failing. If we do not reinstate the strength of our private health system to take the pressure off our public health system, our world-class sort of envy of the world healthcare system will no longer be that. So I'm a great believer that the private-public partnership that exists in Australia is why we've had the greatest health system in the past. So we need to make sure the sector gets together and protects that. And this idea of the health insurers fighting with the hospitals and fighting with the specialists and fighting with the medtech sector and then fighting with the government and fighting with the public sector is not going to get the solution that we need so that Australians have got access to a world-class healthcare sector into the future.
I just want to ask one final question from one of our participants, and then I'll let you go. Edward asks, healthcare delivery is changing, telehealth and digital health are unlocking access and productivity. Yet some in the sector still rally against innovations in care. How can the system evolve when many leading bodies are dragging their heels?
I think, Edward, it goes back to probably the answer to the previous question. We need to have a strong system where people, stakeholders and players are speaking to each other. Because I think if you actually, if you got around a table and brought everybody into the same room, you probably find that there are a lot of things that people agree with. But as long as governments sort of don't bring people together and try and resolve issues, if they allow the various, stakeholders in the sectors to continue to be pitted against each other, you won't move to that. So I think it's a really important change in how we do things. We've actually got to put down our guns in stakeholders, sit around the table and work out how we are going to collectively make the system better for everybody's advantage, because a system that's failing serves nobody. But reverting to your corner and just fighting on your own little patch doesn't solve anything either. So I think it's time we were grown-ups.
Yeah. And look, thank you so much. I know you've had a busy morning and we've gone over time rather, so I really appreciate it. And can I say to everybody, thanks for joining. And I think from having Anne on today, we are truly very lucky to have someone with Anne's commitment and passion in the portfolio, in opposition, fighting the good fight and ultimately keeping the government accountable and prosecuting the key issues in the interest of the community and Australian patients. So Anne, seriously, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.